Hi, welcome to the science track. Woo! We are, well, I guess this is technically our first panel for me. We, meaning me, for the day and for the con. And so please bear with me as I get my mental faculties in order. Before the panel starts, we are requiring that masks are worn for attendance. We will not start the panel if everyone's masks are not over their both their mouth and their nose. So if you've got a mask that does not meet that requirement, please adjust it, and then we can continue. And it looks like I think everybody is looking good. So thank you.
Y'all are very
much.
well behaved. Thank you.
Appreciate everybody following the requirements. So we're here to talk about droids. But first, I want to plug shamelessly our other panels happening in the Hilton Crystal Ballroom, which are down to the left if you exit the hallway, down the escalators. At 1 o'clock, we have Medicine Then and Now. And at 5:30, we have kaiju mapping, so emergency management for Godzilla, Sharknado, that sort of stuff. It's a lot of fun. So what I'll ask now is that we go down the line and our lovely panelists introduce themselves and where they're from, relevant notes about what you've done.
Okay. Good morning. Oh, someone's a hand raised?
Can we close that door, please? There's too much noise coming in.
Thank you, and please do let us know for things like that. We would like you to be able to hear our melodious voices. Like everything is masked, including these mics, so anything we can do to help.
Okay, well, good morning. I'm Theda Daniels-Race. I said not to be pretentious, but I'll put the doctor on there because sometimes I'm like, one of these things is not like the other, if you remember Sesame Street. I really do have a PhD. Anyway, I'm from Louisiana State University. I'm a professor in the Division of Electrical and Computer Engineering. I was nano before nano was cool, as I tell my students. I worked for many years, over a decade, don't look at the gray hair, but at Duke University, and I have a young man here who I think was a student when I was there. My work is in electronic materials, I guess one would say nanoelectronic materials and related phenomena. Our group focuses on, well, the group is the Applied Hybrid Electronic Materials and Structures group, or AHEMS. We would have left off the S, but it would have been like, so that's our name. And we effectively work on everything from deposition of thin films and nanoparticles on through considering the electro-optic phenomena thereof as emitted by these unique and hybrid materials.
Excellent. I am Stephen Granade. I began life as a physicist and then moved into industry, where for my sins I started doing a lot of remote sensing, a lot of robotic sensing, and how do you make measurements with cameras, with radars, with acoustic sensors, and then do something with that, which means now machine learning, that will solve everything. We put it in this black box and turn a crank and answers come out. So that's what I do on the robotics side.
And I'm Topher Hunger. I am also a PhD engineer, but I come from the medical device world. So I've worked a lot on automated diagnostic systems, trying to develop better systems there, but also I am a hobby droid builder, 2 R2s, 2 choppers, 1 BB-8, and currently working on a quarter-scale Perseverance rover.
You get the, ooh.
But not for what I actually get paid to do is the problem.
That is fair.
Great. So we got a lot of really neat experience around sensors and building droids and the technological knowledge that goes behind it. So what actually is a droid? Like what qualifies as a droid? Is it just an AI? Is it something that has some electromechanical, like anthropomorphic kind of like qualities?
Everyone's looking at me for the epistemological question. I think it's a fairly flexible category. We've slapped it on a bunch of different things. In sort of the same way that artificial generalized intelligence is anything we haven't been able to do yet in AI. I feel like Droid is like anything that is not like a car welding arm, or like we're wanting things that are kind of like R2D2 to be droids.
Yeah, I think probably a practical definition would be something along the lines of an unwired automaton capable of independent sense, think, act action. So not plugged into the wall, has some ability to make its own decision about what to do next.
So a Furby. Does that count as a droid?
Yes, actually. I'm going to claim a Furby as a droid.
I never would have thought that was going to come up as a question on the panel.
Listen, I was an impressionable child in the mid-'90s when Furbies came out. They were really cute. They seemed like they were geniuses. So, to me, they're droids. But,
Yeah, I think the audience is on your side with this.
Good.
Yeah?
Let me show of hands, like, are Furbies droids?
I am terrified of the thought.
Well, yes. Good.
You did not know it. At 11:30, you were going to be asked to judge the droidness of Furbies.
Science.
So aside from Furbies, what are we doing now with droids? I mean, I don't think we're doing anything with Furbies anymore, aside from like weird YouTube videos. But
I think certainly the Mars rovers would qualify under the definition I proposed.
absolutely.
And I think, I guess since our panel is entitled The Science and Fiction of Droids, right? In my home, my husband and I have done anything from watch to yell at the television when there's something we consider ridiculous in terms of the science of the droids. But it's still fun. So he loves the show Westworld, which is, they ran a season or two, and hopefully they're coming back. And I don't know, maybe because the droids are attractive. I don't know. But anyway, no, he's a really great guy. Long time married. But I shouldn't put that on him. He'd probably be upset. Why'd you say that? But nevertheless, I think what in my world, so to speak, as I mentioned earlier, in the nanoscale and in academia and in dealing with the public in lectures I've given, you get a lot of fiction of droids. And do you guys, and things that are, I don't know if these would even really qualify as droids, but in terms of the public's perception. So do you guys remember the movie G.I. Joe, where they fired the nanobots and they ate the, the Eiffel Tower? So there's always this sense, like the gentleman said here, they're going to eat your face, right? That's just kind of, unless it's the more anthropological, the humanoid type, but otherwise it's like it's coming to get us. So that's sort of my experience of it and making things smaller and scarier. Right, anyway.
Well, I also think we're pushing, Perseverance is a great example on the science side, but there's also folks looking to use that as weapons of war, as policing. If you look at the videos that Boston Dynamics puts out of their parkour robots, that some police organizations are looking to deploy. So there's a wide range of things we are doing with droids.
Are you aware of whether or not those the Boston Dynamics like parkour robots, are they specific built to run one program, and they're not like, I mean, they have to be sensing the environment around them. You can see those little targets that they must be using visual sensors for. They're running a path, or is it just?
They have a generalized goal, and then have routines to let them overcome the obstacles in their way, and occasionally do dances.
Okay, so they are thinking. They are actively.
They are making decisions based on what they sense in the environment around them.
Right.
Yeah, and Boston Dynamics has been fairly quiet about some of the details of their technology, but what has been publicly released is that it takes many programmers many days to code those cool videos. This is not hey rover, go out and do a dance. So, and in the droid builder world, more the hobbyist level, don't have the millions and millions of dollars. People will often ask, hey, can I, about once a month on the social platforms, we'll get a question of, hey, can I put an AI into my R2 unit and have it, react and respond and follow people? probably the first response anyone ever has is, okay, my R2 is built all out of aluminum. It weighs about 250 pounds. If that thing runs amok, it's going to hurt somebody. I don't want to be liable for that. So you have a lot of, I mean, this is kind of why we were talking. We hopefully next time we do this, we can have a philosopher on the panel, because there's some really cool questions that come up.
So we've got self-driving cars, right? We've been hearing about them for years.
Knowing
self-driving-
chuckles from the audience.
My son wants one. No.
So where are those in? I guess there's a lot of different embedded topics there with like AI, or is it just a simple subroutine? Obviously, it's just like the Boston Dynamics robots. They're sensing things around them, and they're not non-standard things too. So that to me is one of the most impressive things. Right? You watch a Boston Dynamics video, you have those specific design targets so that it can really clearly pick up on it. But a self-driving car is doing kind of almost one level beyond that, even though it seems simpler, where it's like, oh, well, that's a white line, that's a yellow line, that's a dotted line, and I wonder if anybody knows any more detail about those than I do. Hopefully.
I can talk some to that if no one else is. And we've got a question over here. We saw your hand. We'll come back to you. Almost run over by a self-driving vehicle. I'm sorry, and not that surprised. The world, as a sensor person, the world is really rough. It's much better if you can have a more controlled environment, and streets are chaotic. One of my former coworkers actually came to us from Delphi, that was a company that made parts for cars, all kinds of different parts, and they had an R&D group in the late 2000s that was trying to do the lane following that have now shown up in cars. And they kept having problems because if the road is wet, it is reflective and looks different, and you can get reflections that look like car lights. The paint on lanes are not always in the best condition, or there are gaps, and is that gap a side street? And then when you start talking about other cars and the unpredictability of drivers, then you start talking about pedestrians and cyclists and motorcyclists who already have a tough time on our streets. It's a very kind of scary environment. As someone who's worked for a number of years in computer vision, that's a tough problem. And for all of the amazing things that we can do, it's still really rough. And other ways of sensing have other issues. You can use radar, but typically you don't get as fine-grained an image to work with as you do with light. You can use LiDAR, like a lot of companies are looking at, I'm going to send out laser beams and map in 3D the space around me. Again, that's not a whole lot of data to work with. The LiDARs, if you're going to have them inexpensive enough to put on cars, you don't get a whole lot of data. And then you've got this big sort of point cloud of spots in 3D, and you're trying to say, well, I think that's a person and that's a car. I've got to group these things together. Like the grouping and figuring out what things are is an ongoing, really tough problem. And that's before then, after all of that, throwing on the layer of saying, and now I'm going to decide what to do about it. So I feel decently good at this point about lane following guidance, and anything past that, I get really twitchy.
There's a great. Oh, sorry.
I was going to say, given those metrics, I don't think we're going to see self-driving cars in New Orleans anytime soon. And I don't mean just because of the hurricanes and the floods. We live in Baton Rouge now. My dear parents are in New Orleans. They're okay, thank God, and my sister's taking care. But that being said, the wetness, the reflections, and my husband and I live in Baton Rouge now, but growing up in New Orleans, potholes for days. I mean, there's streets where there's not even a line. In fact, down the street from where my parents live, which is a decent area, basically middle class neighborhood, just one day a hole went down the street, and a car, not I don't know how deeply, but a car went into a sinkhole just because it's about floating, they're below sea level. And so I definitely relate and am concerned just as a person, about that kind of thing, even though our oldest lives in California here and his wife. And at one point he was talking about the cars that don't even have a steering wheel that have been made. And I freaked out, I mean, he's an adult and can do what he wants, but he's cheap too, so he's not going to pay a lot of money. So I'm not too worried. But if the price comes down. But yeah, that being said, it's the concern of first and foremost safety, right? Because we all have these liabilities. I have students, and God forbid anything ever happen to them. That's my first thing. I don't care what you do, just be safe. And if you're not sure, don't be. Does anybody remember Dexter's Laboratory? Remember DD? What does that button do? I've had a couple of DDs in the lab, and I'm like, no, go do theory. Sorry, no, get out of here. Okay, so sorry.
No,
Topher,
that was great. There's a great book called You Look Like a Thing and I Love You, and I cannot remember the author.
Janelle Shea.
Thank you.
Yeah, write that down.
Fantastic book about the current state of AI, and they talk a lot about, I guess we can say Tesla, and their technology, and some of the problems that they've encountered. Because, like, when you program these giant AI databases, you basically throw a bunch of images at them to have them learn on, and then you throw another set of images and you test them. Well, if maybe your database of pictures of semis is all from the side, and then the car actually encounters a semi from behind, it has no idea that it's the same thing. And that actually happened. That was one of the early accidents with the Tesla. You Look Like a Thing and I Love You. Great book. Everyone go buy it.
Yeah, one of the big challenges when you're talking about any kind of machine learning is how much data do I have? How good is it? How independent is it? So that, again, having a bunch of pictures of semis from one side doesn't let you recognize them from head on, maybe. And that's one of the reasons why Tesla has been pulling images from their car cameras and just sucking in more and more and more data to try to cover the wide gamut of things that you're going to run into in the world. It's a tough problem. And really, when you talk about machine learning, what you're asking is, can you find some subset of features that you can then associate with a class? So that I can say, this is a semi, this is a truck, this is a pedestrian. And most of the advances in the imaging world have come from just pouring buckets of data in there and using neural nets to let it find the features. Because we spent decades, humans, saying, well, let's look for edges and corners, or we'll look for circles and trying to pick the features. And eventually the answer was just enough data and an algorithm that will try to figure out the features on our own that we don't know the features it's picking, but they're effective, is the most quickest route to good results. But then you've got to have a lot of data covering the cases that you care about. And hopefully that's all of the cases when it comes to self-driving cars.
And then novelty. Novelty is a disaster.
So I have a kind of a funny story that's connected to this. It just popped into my brain. I had a friend, so this is like a problem that I can potentially see with self-driving cars and maybe all sorts of droids. That we worked at UMass for moving services. So you move a whole bunch of furniture around. So they were driving big trucks, and he was driving one day with a friend, and they were backing up, and he asked his friend who was in the passenger seat, "Hey, do you see anything?" And he goes, "No, I don't see anything." And he asked him, he's like, "Hey, do you see anything?" No, I don't see anything. Okay, and they kept going backwards, and well, it's because they were driving a big truck. They couldn't see the small Jaguar behind them, and so they crushed a Jaguar because, well, not like a car.
Oh, no, I know. I love Jaguars, the car. I love the car.
It was Western Mass.
I have a Tesla Model 3. I've had it for 3 years. I do not have the full self-driving, but I do have the lane following and the intelligent
Distance cruising.
things a lot of cars have. And Tesla tells you over and over, and they make you keep your hand on the wheel. So anyone who does have full self-driving and is not paying attention is an idiot. It should not even own the car.
Right. I mean, that's just risk assessment at that point, like personal choice risk.
So there's, I cannot believe I'm going to say these words. There is an interesting law review article from 2015 looking at what kind of laws for robots, so rather than laws of robotics, laws about robotics, that talks about how liability and property are going to be the initial things that the law is concerned about and is going to try to figure out how to map existing laws onto robots and droids as they become more common and more out in the world, and that you can see the problems that we're going to have by how the laws to govern the internet had to be bootstrapped from like radio and TV and the gaps that that caused. So I think a lot of the things that we're seeing around self-driving cars, who is at fault, are going to be the case when you start talking about droids. If my R2 runs over someone, am I liable or is the robot liable?
And to plug another book, there's a great one called Wired for War. It's almost a decade old now, but the author is a well-respected war correspondent, and they go through a lot of the reality, the law, and the ethics and the morality of primarily on combat-based robots. But yeah, some really cool reading there too. Wired for War.
I have to jump in on Stephen's comment because about 2 months ago I did a talk with an attorney called The Science and Ethics of Nanotechnology. And one of the things he pointed out was that the law always lags the science, right? Something has to happen in the science or there's a concern. Certainly, patent lawyers, that's kind of a different deal. But the law, he says, is very much so behind the science. And he also spoke from a medical perspective, had to do with, for example, with insurance. There was a condition, I don't remember the medical name, that kids would be born with years, like say maybe in the 70s or something. And the deal was companies wouldn't insure them. So there were all these families, we have seen this even today, but we saw all these families suffering. And then the law caught up with that event. And I have to throw in is that this person with whom I did the talk is my husband. And and he has his MD and a JD. He's a physician. He got a law degree, never got sued. It was nothing like that. He was interested in health policy and such. So he delivered babies for many years, took a leave from his practice, and then got a law degree. And then ended up, he liked teaching. So I told him, because he had a captive audience that has to listen. And so he's also a professor, a law and medicine professor at Southern University Law Center. But to your point, that is so much so the case is that, unfortunately, now you can see liability and so forth, maybe property happening, but when you're on the research end, and I'm dealing with, zinc oxide nanoparticles or, transition metal dichalcogenides, TMCs, and these are like molybdenum disulfide, so molybdenum from your periodic chart and sulfur. And yeah, it sounds cool that maybe we can get coatings and we can maybe get some electronic phenomena out of that. But then there is the issue of, even with carbon nanotubes that I dealt with for a while there, what if something goes, we wear a mask in the lab. We do all that, safety first. But, out there, not only the public at times misconception, but really the public's real concerns environmentally and so forth of these materials at the nanoscale that macroscopically end up maybe building a droid or what have you. But at that first level, what happens in a lab, beyond the lab? So the law is very much part of the science, but it really does tend to lag the science, at least according to my colleague and spouse.
So we had a question back here?
Where's the line between robot and droid? Some of the things you mentioned at the beginning, I was like, oh, I thought that was a robot, and you called it a droid. So is there a line, or?
So strictly speaking, a droid is an android, which is a humanoid robot.
Right.
But then you look at R2-D2 as a trash can, they're like, that's a droid. So I feel like there is some slippage in that terminology. And I kind of feel like in this panel, we're going to end up talking on the broader umbrella of droids, robots, AI, and all of that. But that is sort of the canonical dictionary definition it's got to look kind of person-like.
Yeah, so language evolves, right? Is I think the big takeaway from that, right?
Star Wars.
Yeah, I think so. I've also worked on some medical robots and surgical assistant robots, and yeah, I think there's. I would probably try to define the distinction being a robot per se acts out a pre-programmed set of actions that I've pre-chosen for it, and it may adjust slightly based on some sensor input, but primarily it's following the path I told it to do. Same for manufacturing robots, which I've also played around with a little bit. Whereas a droid, I would think more of, so a medical droid would be something that actually does, takes in an MRI and makes a therapeutic selection for the patient based on that data, and then proceeds on its own with minimal human interaction and input. So is it autonomous in its sense, think, act, or is it primarily driven by a human?
So would you then see a gradation, since there are levels of autonomy that a lot of these systems have, from, human doing everything to human sort of on the loop looking for decisions, or
Yeah.
human, like, I think the Army has 5 levels of autonomy, from human all the time to it's doing its thing,
Yeah,
it'll report back.
Yeah, we send the Predator out there and it comes back and we go, where'd your missiles go?
Yay.
But and in surgical robots, actually, we're currently seeing that, because there are some of the robots that are very much like the ROSA system from Zimmer Biomet is just a cut guide aid. It positions assistance such that the surgeon can then go in and do the cuts. The Da Vinci system is
Yes.
much more of autonomous and has a certain level of independent decision making. And then there's cool things like the one that was done out of Calgary by the Canada Arm people. I can't remember the name of it, but it's for brain surgery, and it actually, so it takes in the CT and MR data and figures out a safe path in the head. So it says, that artery, no touch, that tumor, touch, and it figures out. And the surgeon is then in another room using joysticks to guide the instrumentation into the head. But the robot is saying, no, bad boy. And it actually, the robot will refuse to accept inputs that diverge out of what's been defined as its safe lane. So there's some really cool kind of I'm not sure where that is on the spectrum.
Oh,
Anyway.
if you want. Yeah, sure. So we've got a wireless mic now. So if you do have a question, please raise your hand. We'll bring it on. I think there was one here, but maybe it's been answered.
Can I throw in one quick? I had surgery some years back with the Da Vinci, right? And at the time, I thought, even though my husband is an MD and he's brilliant, respect him, this other MD, who's great guy, going to do the surgery, when he told me it would be robotic surgery, as an electrical engineer, the first thing I was like, I honestly, now I realize my ignorance of the medical end of it. But he didn't say that. He said, well, blah 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 blah, it'll be a robotic surgery, and so I said, are you gonna be there? Because I was picturing the joystick thing, and I'm like, okay, I thought it was a kind of laparoscopic thing, and then he says, well, yes, and I said, robotic, right? But the point is that I'm so glad you asked that question about the line between robotic and droid, because I was very much a layman, and of course, as thinking about a surgery, when he said it will be a robotic surgery. And I remember coming home and going, I'm sorry. I was like, you guys, you doctors, you're using the term robotic. This is ridiculous. What do you mean it's robotic? That's not, because to me, the robotic was more on the droid end of it. And I thought it was a misuse of the term. And, made me think, is the guy going to be behind a glass, joystick in it, which, he was okay. But I didn't think, in medicine, correct me if I'm wrong, but kind of anything that's not just the human, say maybe doing the surgery, they kind of call it robotic. Even
It's a very sloppy term.
Yeah.
And I can definitely say
Doctors.
yeah, and I was like, don't do that to an engineer,
no
man.
longer employed by a company that makes and sells those things. They're largely a marketing ploy. A lot of the conversation is basically with the clinic, so that they can put up a billboard saying, now offering robotic surgery. It may offer clinical benefit to the patient. It may not. And it's really complex. And don't just dive into, yay, it's robotic, and therefore I should go for it because it's cool. Because it might not be the right choice for you.
Yeah, to tie all the
It was okay.
a few of these things together, like the concern of, well, is it going to do its job? Is it going to do it correctly, or is someone going to be monitoring it? I'm a quality engineer, so that's what quality engineering would be, where you actually validate the process that something goes through, right? So if I were you, I'd ask for the validation study and make sure that the output is actually what they expect it to be. And then we talked about how the Tesla only had a couple different features. It only had front and back and left and right. And that's a limitation. That's a choice, right? Because they've chosen that, okay, these are the things that we can actually control well enough to deploy. And, there's a lot of other things they could do, but it would just go, bonkers at this point, at the state of technology. So
Actually, go beyond that now. They can actually drive from their house to work.
sure, sure. So I think there was a question in front.
Yeah, actually, it's more a comment. You know, I'm fascinated by the concept of anthropomorphic being a part of the definition of droid, and also being a way to differentiate droids from other, you know, kind of automatons or robotic things. And we, you know, talking about R2D2, you know, we think droid, we think Star Wars. You know, it's just so part of the lexicon now. But even though like R2D2 and a lot of the droids in Star Wars do not look humanoid, they're still very anthropomorphic in that they have personalities, they have sense of humor. So you still actually do have that anthropomorphic element to them that's very distinct. So because that's how I always thought about it. I always thought droid being short for android means that it's somehow anthropomorphic. It's going to present as human. But I don't know that we need to limit that to necessarily physical appearance. There's still like emotional elements and personality elements.
There's a lot to an entity.
Yeah, you know, that so just kind of to add that.
And just to make sure that we're succinct here, if you have a question, let's make sure it's a question. Like ends with an upward inflection. The question mark.
And ideally can fit in a tweet.
Yeah.
An old style tweet.
That'd be cool.
So I have a question since we've been talking about anthropomorphization of droids. Do your concepts of R2D2 and C3PO, do they have a gender? I'm saying some yes and some no. And it is interesting to me how we're seeing some of the exploration of gender and the societal construction of gender be echoed in the fiction of droids. How many people have seen Space Sweepers?
Oh, I think so.
Go see
Netflix?
Space Sweepers on Netflix.
Oh, I
It
turned
is
it off.
super cool.
Sorry.
There is a robot Bubs in there, a former military droid who is saving up for a skin graft and is a woman, but has a male presenting voice and a military body. So the initial implication is, oh, this is a dude, but it is a woman. Conversely, in the book Autonomous by Annalee Newitz, there is a military robot paired with a handler, and the handler starts to have feelings, like romantic and sexual feelings for the robot, and starts projecting gender onto this robot who does not understand or really comprehend gender at all, is like, what do I do with this? So it's interesting to me to see how different creators sort of explore and try to decide how would a non-human intelligence deal with the concept of gender, and would they be sort of have a concept of gender, or would they think differently enough that would just would not, as they say, compute? The movie is Space Sweepers on Netflix.
Right, so this is really interesting in like, you know, so now we're starting to get into, well, what do droids mean to us in our cultural context, right? Like, and or in the context of the lore that they exist in, right? So it means stuff there, it means stuff here. I'd love to hear more about that, but first let's take a question.
Hi, so my question, ooh, that's really effective. My question is, I'm a biology teacher. My question is kind of an extension. We've been talking about the difference between a droid and a robot, but what about the difference between a droid and mechanical life form? My students seem to think, and kind of falls in line with the popular media, that it has to do with sentience and intellectual ability. Whereas as a biologist, I think it has to do with reproductive ability. I'm thinking, of course, of the replicants from Stargate. So where do you guys fall on that question?
A great question.
I like how we're all looking at each other. Like,
Yeah.
oh, goodness.
Biology guy on the end?
have not thought about that part of it. Cool idea. I mean, there's right the running joke of, you know, how do you get a 3D printer? You buy one, you print out another one, and then you send it back to the store. Doesn't work. But yeah, it's an interesting question. When does a robot able to build another robot of its identical one?
Has there ever been? I'm trying to rack my brain for a movie or a storyline or something where the mechanical / robot / droid could reproduce. Does anybody?
There's a lot of hands.
So we've got Grey Goo, we've got Fred Saberhagen's Berserker series. Screamers.
Yeah, it's based off Philip.
Yes, that's based off a Philip K. Dick short story, and it's robots making more robots and exterminating
Okay.
humans, which is a thing that we seem to expect droids
Grey
are
goo,
going to do.
yeah, I've talked about grey goo in terms of people's perception or really misperception, but I didn't think of that
will you
as
talk a little bit
reproduction.
about Grey
Oh,
goo?
yeah, was it Eric? I'm blanking out on the name and I have it in my, Eric, is it not Dyson? Derek, anyway. The whole point, as I recall, now you guys who have read it more recently or may know better, but there is a public perception of some that there would be replicating nanobots, some say what have you, but tiny things that will eventually just keep developing, and envelop the Earth in what's effectively a gray goo. And this, by the way, even though it, the concept, and forgive me, I can't remember the name of the person who, I think his first name is Eric, is actually, I hate to give this reference of Wikipedia, I tell my students, but Wikipedia is great in many ways, but you have to be careful. Our youngest one time as a little kid went, Wikipedia is evil, and I was like, all right. But, because I have friends now that are wiki editors, so I don't want to offend anybody with that, but, early on it was, but yeah, the concept, the gray goo was this self-reproducing, but when I think of it, as you're saying, that's not the reproduction per se that I don't, is that what your students are asking? Because again, my husband's medical work was as an OBGYN, so obviously reproduction, there's books all over the house, right? So I don't think of self-replication, because that's almost like what, like an oyster or something that buds. I'm thinking about something like has a baby. Is that what your students mean?
Single cells are living things, and they
True.
self-replicate.
Okay, is that? But do you consider that reproduction in the sense that they're asking? Okay, I was thinking of it the more far afield of something giving some sort of birth beyond the cellular level, but as we would while we were all sitting here, right?
No, sexual life is in the minority.
Okay.
Yeah,
That should be on a T-shirt.
It's a first science track T-shirt. I actually am good with the idea that we would map, our definition of life from biology onto robots, because our definition of life for biological systems keeps growing as we discover new forms of life, as we start looking at extremophiles. Life covers a much broader category than we thought, even 10, 20 years ago. And I think robots, droids, other mechanical life will stretch that further.
So, 3D printing, a 3D printer, I think actually really falls really well into this topic that we've got here, because of the whole idea that you can literally print an entire 3D printer. I'm not saying it's going to work great, but you can reprint an
You're going to
entire
have a
3D
challenge with
printer.
the electronics for one thing.
Well, sure,
But,
sure. There's
That's what the nanobots are for.
Well, okay. There's something called the Igem Competition. Lolly, are you familiar with it? Okay. It's now I'm blanking on what it stands for, but basically it's I forget what the I, but it's genetically engineered machines. So it's a undergraduate competition. Student groups get together all over North America and compete to create genetically engineered microbes to achieve a certain task. So can I make I can't even think of what some of the recent ones have been, but say I wanted to have a biological billboard, right? I could trace out the words I want in a select set of nutrients or metabolic factors, and then only the bugs that I've engineered are going to only grow on that surface. So suddenly I get a bug board, and then you can do all sorts of cool stuff. So the Igem competition, the reason I go to there is because it flips the whole idea of machine on its head, where they're looking at there's no metal, no plastic. It's a biologic organism that has been completely engineered to go from input to output, like we would think of as a machine. So there's a biologic that is maybe more of a machine, but it is self-replicating. So maybe maybe we're coming at it the wrong direction.
Right. So as an engineer, I think always what are you building something for? What's the purpose of the output, right?
Because it's fun.
So do we have any droids in existence in lore or in the real world now? I don't think in the real world, but in lore perhaps, where they're just an entity, right? Like they just exist for the sake of existing.
Wasn't that? Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, please.
Wasn't that the whole? I did not follow this series, but I like the sort of spin-off, the whole Battlestar Galactica. But remember the show Caprica? Anybody? I was so mad when they canceled that. Like with Alphas too, when they canceled that, like out of the blue. If you saw Big Bang Theory, and Sheldon and I were really ticked off. Yeah, but the wasn't that part of the thing of they somehow were their own, I'd say, species, race, etc. And they just existed. I mean, they did things because it was a TV show, right? They had to do good and bad things. But I'm just trying to think of what you should say in lore. That's kind of mind for me.
Data is the first one that
of course.
I think of.
Of
Is
course.
Sung is like, I'm gonna make me a robot friend.
And I'm a Trekkie. Shame on me. Sorry.
who just happens to look a lot like me, because that's not vanity.
Right. And then there's the whole Picard thing. Oh yeah, Measure of Man, right? Is the episode. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, use it.
So the point was recollecting that episode of Star Trek where Data is able to change his own programming, and therefore he is sentient.
What about Bicentennial Man with Robin Williams? Now, if anybody's
Yeah,
dating
as I
myself
recall,
big time.
he got to be counted as human because he died.
In the end, they had a trial, and the whole thing was over. They kept sort of replacing the artificial bits with, biological bits, and in the end, he kind of, I think just about all of him, and then he went on, I think, married, had a family, the whole deal, and then died. But there was a big trial. That's been in literature a lot, or TV, at least the media, the idea of the Pinocchio, syndrome, as I call it. When does this thing, being, or whatever creation take on a life of its own? And even Data said, remember, he was called Pinocchio at one point in the show.
Because evidently the highest thing a droid can aspire to is to become human?
Yeah.
Seems specious.
Very self-serving.
They didn't see 2020.
So we have a question right down in the front here.
Oh.
So yeah, let's make sure that we're raising our hands and waiting for the microphone because we're getting a little out of order. So, are we all set over here now? Okay.
On the topic of sentient life forms that were basically existing mechanical beings, there's a video game called Mass Effect, and it had beings called the Geth and the Reapers, and they were both entities that originally came from a human civilization or an advanced civilization, and developed to basically surpass human limitations and took over and ended up kind of resetting the universe. And it led me to think about a different question, which was, in popular fiction, robots are commonly shown, or droids in all forms are commonly shown to have like axioms they cannot violate. Like, you can't kill humans, you must obey your programming. Is that something that's actually achievable in the sense that they truly cannot violate? Or if AI is given enough time and effort, could it potentially break that idea?
The 3 laws?
Yeah.
What is it?
Yeah.
From the Martian. Oh,
Oh,
God.
from Isaac Asimov.
Asimov. 3 laws.
3 laws of robotics, yeah. Get him mic.
The microphone
We
needs
can't
use
hear.
there.
Or stand up and yell, please.
All right, so the 3 laws are: Law 1, a robot must not harm a human being or through inaction allow a human being to come to harm. 2, a robot must always obey the commands of a human being except where that violates the first law. And 3, a robot must do everything it can to protect its own existence except where that violates laws 1 and 2.
So what about Law 0?
Beautiful.
Ah, what a great question. So Asimov is writing all these stories to kind of, he's like, I'm going to set logic puzzles and write fiction that are logic puzzles. And then after a while, one of his later books, he's exploring the question of robots and the laws of robotics. And it's like, all right, protecting humans, but then what about humanity? And so the robots come up with Law Zero, that is, a robot must essentially protect humanity above individual humans. And I think that points to some of the issues of saying, I'm going to draw a bright line and the robot will not go past this bright line. Well, how bright is that line? What are you going to do the first time the robot encounters Philippa Foot's trolley problem, where it's like, well, do I kill 5 people or 1 person? What if I know the 1 person? I can't help but think of the great episode of The Good Place where they make the trolley problem literal. No system of logic can cover everything. Like, that's just part of Gödel's incompleteness theorem. And the fact that you're always going to have some axioms that you just put down and derive from there, but you can't derive back to itself. I don't think, especially if you're talking about an intelligence that is going to be able to adapt and act, that you would be able to have a set of rules that covered everything. All the corner cases, all of the individual issues you might run into. And in some ways, I tie it back to the whole self-driving car problem. How much data do you have to define the borders of this line that you have created and how it's going to twist and turn through the real world?
Right.
Is that not both the joy and the fear or horror of the typical trope of, we have these steps, these rules, what happens if they go to left field? Right. And that was, what makes so many amazing types of fiction, right, both television, movies, etc., is, okay, here are the parameters, and then, we never thought of that, and now lots of times it's used in horror, right, or some aspect of sci-fi, bad things happen. But that's the point, and I think it goes back, this is, I think, very dated, but the old garbage in, garbage out. We are not perfect. And we are the ones programming these things or coming up with the thought of what, it sounds great, but you know that, as you just quoted beautifully, the 3 laws of robotic from Asimov. And if you've read the book, right, you know what happens in every chapter. There's something that goes awry, from the romantic robot we talked about earlier, but maintaining those 3 laws. And it's phenomenal for writers to be able to handle that. But if you think about it for reality, are we back to the gray goo, or?
Right, so we're like concerned. This is like what do they mean to us? Like, what do they mean in our culture? And one of the main things that Stephen mentioned earlier is like, whoa, we're worried that they're going to just take us over. And it's kind of interesting to me. I'm sure it exists, but I haven't been made aware of it. Is like the Jurassic Park equivalent of a robotic story, right? Like, oh, you're designing these, they're not capable of reproducing, but then suddenly something comes up that allows
basically
them to reproduce.
Westworld in a lot of ways.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, good. There you go.
Westworld was a Michael Crichton story, yes.
You got hands
Jurassic
everywhere.
World, but with robots.
So
I'm sensing a franchise.
I'll have to read that for you guys. So we had a question right in the middle.
Yeah, I guess on a more prosaic level, what are you seeing or expect to see in the near future as far as home droids to help, say, like physically disabled people complete tasks or reach things or things like that?
This isn't a droid per se, but even in my work, as I said, many times now, the nanoscale, we think about this with regard to, we're all at some point aging. And so one of the instruments that we use is an atomic force microscope, which effectively lets you see, down to the nanoscale. But I had a student, a brilliant young woman, work year before last, before the pandemic, on an atomic force microscope that was more accessible in terms of motor skills and in terms of eyesight. Even though you're not looking at a microscope objective, you're still looking at a screen. But to some of the manipulations, and particularly if anybody's involved in optics and lasers, getting the mirrors and all that's why I don't do that. But getting everything aligned and making it more accessible. And now if you could combine that with a more robotic action. But again, many times when things are designed, we think of ourselves, right? We don't, unless you're in some way disabled, you don't think about, like I came here with, sometimes my back acts up, so I got a cane. So I might think of, what if somebody that wasn't as balanced? But and that's the whole thing, even with, airbags for cars that happen. Originally, a lot of people got crushed, and then I don't know if this is urban legend, but I heard that there were no women in the design team. And then later, when they started adding women, they thought about smaller body size, impact, children, and then it became safer.
And crash test dummies were all basically looked like me. Yeah, so there were a lot of problems with the test data.
So it's in there, but it's not really in the, in the mix, I think.
And there's a really great episode of the podcast Flash Forward by Rose Eveleth that looks at exoskeletons and talks about exoskeletons for folks with disabilities and the problems building on that a lot of engineers are like, I'm going to build an exoskeleton and it's going to help people, and they never actually talk to or bring in the community that they're supposed to be helping.
Yes.
They do not recognize that bodies come in many different shapes and sizes and configurations. So in some ways, really what I'd like to see is less of a technological shift and more of a societal shift, so that the communities who are in theory going to be benefiting from this are actually having a voice, and that we do not use that as an excuse, for example, not to spend $1,000 on a ramp to make a building accessible, and instead go for, $100,000 Segway.
Yeah.
I think number one, I'm going to contradict you. You said there's a good episode of Flash
lots
Forward.
of them.
They're all good.
Good for this topic is what I should have said.
Flash Forward, Rose Eveleth, great. But so both a happy and a sad story in med device. Unfortunately, chase the money, right? That's the big thing. So in lower limb prosthetics, we had the development of the C-leg, which is a lower limb below the knee amputation prosthesis. Has onboard computation. It has adaptive gait capabilities. It's amazing. It really makes people be able to have a completely transparently normal gait when they're wearing this thing. Problem is, it's bloody expensive, and insurance companies basically said after they were usually veterans who had a combat amputation, and they were getting about 2 years worth of support for the C-leg, and then it was, sorry, we're no longer supporting it, and it's going to be out of pocket for you. So most of the veterans were unable to maintain the C-leg. Better story, happier story. One of my former employers, we developed total knee prostheses. This is not robotics, but I think it'll tie in. Total knee prostheses, so when you're getting a joint replacement. Many, many years ago, they launched a big project where they called it the gender knee, because men and women are anatomically a little bit different. So they thought, okay, we're going to develop a knee that's targeted at the female anatomy. Built it, sold it, turned out it really didn't work for that many people, because the problem is the bell curve of male and female overlaps so much. What they realized is that actually it wasn't just working great for women, it was working great for any smaller male. So it turned out that they just did away with the gender part of the brand name, and now they sell this much broader set of knee systems that anatomically fits a much wider group of people. So this little attempt to create a niche market turned into, holy cow, we've actually helped everyone by doing this. So, and I think that ties into your statement of, sometimes making something that if we just focus on helping a subset, we're not thinking about how everybody's going to do great. Like curb cuts are amazing, and I benefit them, and I can walk fine. So anyway.
So what, if each of you had a favorite droid from lore, which would it be, and why? Like, what does it mean to you? What speaks to you about it?
Start there, because
I mean, for me, literally, it's like walking through Dragon Con and seeing the droids that people build, which, based on our previous conversation here, may not be droids necessarily, but, seeing them, it warms my heart. I don't even care which format it is, like the little Wally that will wave at you, and it's just so lovely. That's the most powerful thing for me. But I don't read a lot, and I don't consume a lot of media. Obviously, I didn't know what Westworld. I knew what Westworld was. I didn't know what it was. So, I'm sure you three will have a much better, robust library to search from. Sure.
Okay, as a Trekkie, and I do still say Trekkie. I know there are Trekkers, but I'm from the old generation. I should say Data. I should, but I'm going to ramp it up into the 2000s. I was rather touched by, and somebody remind me of her name. She's a British woman who played the role in Westworld. She was sort of the madam of the saloon, but her
Yeah.
sense. What was her name, y'all?
The character was May.
Maeve, thank you. Maeve, okay. I have a good friend named Maeve. Oh, wow, okay. Maeve, if you remember in that storyline, or just to briefly tell you, was she went from what people were doing effectively was using these droids for, whether it was Roman orgies to, the Western parts or whatever. And she essentially took on board a daughter. And just like a parent would, right, she wanted to see freedom for herself and the daughter. And at one point she was going to leave the daughter with another droid to live, hopefully happily in the West world. She herself was going to leave. Technically, she may have been programmed to do this, but she came back. And long story short, I hope it's not a bad spoiler, but there was essentially you think of a door of light, right, that these droids could see. Now, to us, it was just people falling off a cliff. To them, it was going through a lighted door and into a world where these horrible humans who had abused them in any number of ways, and she was able, as she was shot, of course, and dying, to watch her child go into this world. And so they did the whole gamut, I think, of the, tugging on the heartstrings, of course, but also what happens in this development. And I almost dare not say AI because there's a student in the back, and if I say something wrong about AI, he's brilliant with AI. Both of them, I'm going to get picked on later. So, so I would just say, or machine learning. Excuse me. I'm sorry, I already messed up. Right, machine learning. But that would have to be, I guess, Maeve, because of the range that they gave this person from this used and abused to coming to her own, to being a bad you-know-what woman. I like those characters, gotta admit. And then ultimately, though, having the heart to take care of a loved one. So that would be
Yeah, it's very human, right? It's really getting at a lot of the multifaceted aspects of an entity, I guess, a person that you would know. So
My answer has definitely changed over time. My first exposure to droids was probably Star Wars, and then followed by R. Daniel Olival, who was one of the characters in Isaac Asimov's Robot Mysteries. And I was kind of in like those two poles of like the bickering odd couple with a big personality, and then the we're doing logic with logic robot. But recently, I am going to stand for Bubs from Space Sweepers, because Bubs is cool as all get out. Bubs' job on this ship, where they are trying to clear space of debris, is Bubs stands on top of the ship with this big-ass harpoon to spear the space debris, and is up there, like, in the meantime, just sitting on a lawn chair reading Rilke for entertainment. Bubs has a rich inner life, is what I'm saying, y'all. I like Bubs a lot.
It's over.
I'd have to say currently it's Murderbot from the Martha Wells books, and I'll be wearing Murderbot on Saturday. Murderbot is an agender former security robot that has broken their own programming and basically strikes out on their own, but their only real care in the world, ostensibly, is watching soap operas while wandering around and doing lots of good in the galaxy. So great books.
Great. Well, thanks very much. We've got some other questions, but we didn't have time for them. So if you want to come up and talk to the panelists, you can. This is a great time having you all here and having this conversation. Let's thank our panelists for their input. Oh yeah. We'd like to do a panoramic photo if
This
you're
is for my
willing
folks
to.
in New Orleans. My dad's 91, high school math teacher. You could 100%. You could talk to him like we're talking here. Same with Mom. I dare not say her age, or she'll jump out of a wall and material like that.
So if you don't want to be in a photo,
Yeah.
please leave immediately.
But if you don't
But if
mind,
you don't mind,
wave
that'd
and
be
go
great.
like, "Hey, Mr. and Mrs. Daniels" or something. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. 1, 2, 3.
Hi, Mr. and Mrs. Daniels.
Thank you so much, you guys, and my panelists.
Also, we have science track ribbons if you would like to add to your ribbon collection if you're a ribbon collector.
Yes.
We have original flavor and goose.
Yes, and we're also collecting change like we do every year at Dragon Con for Big Brothers Big Sisters. And if you have any, please throw it in the bucket up here. And then just exit straight through the back. And thank you for coming to Science Track.
You are a great mod.
There are two different flavors.